Today will be a lot of information around the Dutch activities during World War II. So that's something we're going to talk about in quite some detail. I also have to tell you that we had, of course, yesterday Vandyk and Sarah Hutton as the Australian representatives. Another representative who would have here be today is Jared Bly. And Jared is the Deputy Prime Minister, the Deputy Premier of Queensland. And he has his grandfather, was in the camps in Java. So he has that history. And he was looking forward to actually come and tell that story today as well. Unfortunately, that's happening with politicians. They're busy, they've got all sorts of other things to do. So he apologized for not being here, but he has invited me to have a meeting with him, and he will then discuss it. And actually he has prepared to share his story that we can actually put on our website. So, you know, it's a nice gesture from Jared, but he apologized for not being able to be here. Of course, today I also very much would like to welcome our ambassador of the Netherlands, Adi Stoijs-Braken. And as I also mentioned yesterday, the Dutch government is the main sponsor of this activity, etc. So we are very grateful once again, Ambassador, for all the fantastic support that you've given us, and also, of course, to Doris at the embassy, you know, for all her support as well. Much appreciated. Also, Colonel Andrew Clark from the United States is here with us. Of course, as I mentioned, because there's some new people, sometimes I repeat things, I apologize for that. But of course the Americans set up Camp Columbia in 1942. It's because of the Americans that Brisbane became the Allied capital of Australia. So the Americans played a key role in that. Over 1 million, or close to 1 million soldiers came through Brisbane, American soldiers came through Brisbane. So there's an enormous American history involved in all what we are doing today. So from 42 to 44, the Americans were here. From 44 till 46, 47, the Dutch were here. The last Dutch left in September 1947, and there's a big picture, of an airplane there that shows on the bottom part all the Dutch staff, and on the top all the Australian staff from Archerfield Airport. And the father of Leonore, your father was it, eh? Yeah. Is in that picture, So we've got a direct relationship from here with that picture as well. And when we showed this picture for the first time, Lenore nearly fell over because she didn't realize it, and then she noticed that her father was in that picture. So that was quite an interesting story there, to have that. So so that's the exhibition is there, and some of us had a bit of a special tour from Ethan this morning. That was really worthwhile, and I really would like to mention to you that you see Ethan because just looking at it, just ask him to explain it. It's really a fantastic story that Ethan has to tell about the artifacts that are there, and of course very special is that ceremonial sword that's there as well, that we have on display for the first time. Thanks, Peter, for talking to the ABC this morning. On the Macca's show, he talked about the symposium, so we could also get some media. I spoke on 3 radio interviews, so it really does get attention. We have the support now from Milton and Sarah and the Lord Mayor to take this one step further. So I'm pretty sure that we will be able to create some more momentum around all the sort of things that we are organising. While Casper is walking in, why don't I mention him? Hello, Casper. No, you did it on purpose, so we could actually see you coming in. Casper is, for a long time, has been the honorary consul in Queensland for the Netherlands government, and he has an enormous history, both in the military and in the merchant fleet, in the navy, etc. And so a lot of activity. Yesterday you heard several speakers from the Maritime Museum, and Casper is is the chair of the board, of the Maritime Museum. So there's a lot of connections that we have with Casper.
Between Brisbane, the Netherlands and the Dutch East Indies in World War II. We've got three speakers who I would like to invite up to the podium. Dr. Neville Book, who's over here, who's going to be talking about Dr. Jack Ford's book, Allies in a Bind, Australia and the Netherlands East Indies in World War II, which has been mentioned quite a few times this weekend already. Then we'll have Georgina Devin from the National Archives of Australia, who's going to be talking about the Netherlands East Indies government archival sources at the National Archives of Australia. And then our third speaker for the session is Robyn Vandyk with Dutch Voices in the Australian War Memorial Archives. So speakers, can you please come up here? Neville, you will take my spot here. Georgina and Robyn, there's some seats there. Because we're just checking how long is it that we get? You get up to 20 minutes. 20? Yeah.
25, but that's okay. We'll make some cuts.
No stress. All yours.
Alright, excellent. Alrighty. Good morning all. Those I haven't met yet, my name is Georgina Devin and I'm the Senior Archival Officer at the National Archives of Australia Queensland office. Although I began my time here at the University of Queensland studying history, I pivoted from historian to archivist and have been so for over 6 years. An archivist role requires us to have a variety of interests rather than a single specialty. But at its core, my role is promoting the collection of the National Archives and assisting people to delve into our collection and locate sources. I'd just like to quickly acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land in which we are meeting today of the Yagara and Turrbal peoples, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. The National Archives can best be described as the memory of our nation. We collect and preserve Australian government records that reflect our history and identity. Governed by the Archives Act of 1983, the National Archives has two main roles. One, to preserve Australia's most valuable government records and encourage their use by the public. And two, to promote good records management by Australian government departments. With more than 52 million items, the collection includes records from 1901 to the present day. However, we do also hold 19th century records that were transferred to the Commonwealth from the colonies at the time of Federation. Under the Archives Act, we're able to provide access to most Commonwealth government records that are over 20 years old. So at the moment, we're opening records that were created up to the end of 2004. There's a National Archives office and collection in each state and territory. Our Queensland office, where I work, is in Cannon Hill. These photos are of our preservation facility in Canberra, where many of our records are stored. Our collection consists of 375 shelf kilometres of records nationwide. Most of the records we look after are paper-based, such as files, but we also have a large collection of photographs, films and other objects, and now, of course, digital media. So since the symposium relates to World War II, I thought I'd start off by letting you all know that last year, National Archives completed a 5-year project to digitise all our World War II service records, making more than 1 million files available for viewing online. You can do a name search in our online database record search to find service records for those who served in World War II. So this example of a service record is of Benjamin Rudolph Marx, who was born in the Netherlands, who served with the 111 Light Anti-Aircraft Regiment. So the purpose of my session this morning is to highlight some of the records found at the National Archives that relate to the Netherlands East Indies Government and Defence Forces situated in Brisbane, and in particular at Camp Columbia in Waco. The National Archives holds many records relating to the NEI government in exile in Brisbane. These records are located in Canberra, Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane, with some still at not yet examined status, meaning that they've never been looked at. On the left is what a standard Commonwealth Government file cover looks like, and for this seminar we had a number of items located in our Melbourne and Canberra offices digitised, and making them freely available to be viewed online. And on the right is a revised block plan of 1945 of Camp Columbia. And at the end of the talk, if I've got time, I'll show you how to find these on our database. With the War of the Pacific nearing its end, the Dutch started to prepare for the recolonisation of the Netherlands East Indies. On the 25th of October 1943, this memo was sent to the Australian Minister to the Netherlands in October regarding planning for post-war reconstruction in the Netherlands East Indies. Department of Army reports that Acting GCO Netherlands Army's Forces in Australia has received instructions that Major General L.H. Van Ooyen has been appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Netherlands Forces in Australia and is expected to arrive around about November 1st accompanied by his staff. According to these instructions, General Van Ooyen will be in charge of the post-war reconstruction in the Netherlands, East Indies, and will set up a Department of War in Australia with a staff, to begin with, of about 50. As we have not been informed by the Netherlands government of this proposal, please inquire whether this is in fact the government's wish and advise. The Dutch decided, with the approval of the Australian government, to establish the NEI government in exile. Dr. Vandyk and Baron van Aersen met with Dr. Evatt, Minister of External Affairs, on the 7th of March 1944, and the following day, Baron van Aersen handed the on-screen aid memoir to Dr. Evatt, which reads, "By letter of the 24th of September 1943, the Netherlands Minister in Australia informed the Right Honourable John Curtin, Prime Minister of the forthcoming arrival in Australia of Dr. Vandyk, Netherlands Minister for the Colonies. The purpose of his visit was to acquaint the Commonwealth Government with the intention to establish a Netherlands Indies Government Organisation, and to approach the Commonwealth Government concerning the temporary sojourn of the said Netherlands Indies Government Organisation in Australia." Dr. Evatt wrote to Baron van Aersen on the 5th of April 1944, informing him that the Australian government welcomed the proposal to appoint and establish for the time being in Australia a Lieutenant Governor General of the Netherlands Indies. Ooh, that was not what I intended to do. Baron van Aersen wrote to the Prime Minister of Australia on the 3rd of November 1944. "The establishment of the Netherlands Indies Government, as announced and explained in my memorandum of March 8, 1944, has therefore become a fact. This government will avail themselves with gratitude of the hospitality extended to them by the government of the Commonwealth of Australia and have their temporary seat in Camp Columbia, Brisbane." This Advisory War Council addendum from one of their files on the basing of the Netherlands forces in Australia details an approach on the 4th of September 1944 by Netherlands Minister in Australia regarding establishing 30,000 Dutch Army personnel in Australia. "I have the honour by direction to inform you that my government have decided to organise a force of about 30,000 men soon after the liberation of Holland, and to send these troops to the Far East, where they will be used in the Netherlands East Indies after having undergone some additional training. My government would appreciate if this training could take place in Australia and have instructed me to approach the Commonwealth Government on this subject. I would therefore feel very much obliged if your government could let me know whether in principle they are agreeable to the arrival, accommodation, training and maintenance of the above-mentioned Netherlands forces in Australia." So this is from the same file on the 20th of September 1944. "The question of basing Netherlands forces on Australia is referred for consideration by the Advisory War Council signed by Prime Minister John Curtin. The Department of External Affairs has expressed the following views. It would be politically desirable that a Dutch force should be based on Australia. An Australian contribution in the shape of such assistance to the Dutch in the recovery of the Netherlands Indies would assist to a considerable degree in the realisation of Australia's general policy of fostering Australian influence and creating conditions for the future development of Australian trade in this region." So this excerpt is from a file titled Basing of NEI Forces in Australia from series MP 729/6, Department of Defence Secret Correspondence Files from 1936 to 45, which contains over 3,700 records. On the 21st of September 1944, the Australian War Cabinet approved in principle the Netherlands government's proposal to base 30,000 troops in Australia for training and protection of the Pacific, especially regarding the NEI. Specifically, the proposal of the Netherlands government for the basing of a Netherlands force of approximately 30,000 troops on Australia commends itself to the Commonwealth government in principle, and the government is willing to provide facilities and assistance as may be practicable in the light of its existing and potential commitments. So this excerpt comes from a 5-page report prepared by the Chief of the General Staff in regard to the reception, accommodation, clothing, equipment and training of the Netherlands force of up to 30,000 troops in Australia. The troops will arrive with a minimum of uniform, being untrained and unequipped. They will be trained in Australia using Australian uniforms, clothing, arms and equipment to the greatest extent to which Australia can supply them. The force will be used in the Netherlands Indies in conjunction with other allied forces. So this page hails from a file within series A2680, Advisory War Council Agenda Files from 1940 to 45. On page 106 is a list of standard quartermaster items required by the Royal Netherlands Indies Army and amount required, including almost 193,000 pairs of tan cotton socks, 40,000 mosquito head nets, and 40,500 spoons. So communication and travel between various Dutch military officers across Australia had become difficult and time-consuming, and to prepare for the return to NEI, consolidation was urgently required. So it was decided to move the various Dutch headquarters to Camp Columbia at Waco. This letter from July 12, 1944 relates to the Dutch occupation of Camp Columbia and the question of the lease of the camp to the Dutch through a reciprocal land lease agreement. Camp Columbia was offered to the Dutch rent-free in return for Lend-Lease aid. Allied nations were to provide goods or services to the United States for their assistance in the war under a program known as reversal or reciprocal Lend-Lease. Similar arrangements were made between other allies, such as in this case between Australia and the Netherlands. So on the screen is a 1945 plan of Camp Columbia from a series of plans created by the Department of Defence in Queensland, titled Plans of Army Property. Our Brisbane office holds a number of plans of Camp Columbia in the collection at Cannon Hill, approximately 30 all up. We do seem to hold a lot of records relating to the sewage installation at Camp Columbia. Camp Columbia was built by the US Army in Waco in October 1942 and became the headquarters of the US 6th Army in April 1943, which, once again, as we have already probably touched on. An interesting fact, the Netherlands East Indies government in exile is the only foreign government to be established on Australian soil. Camp Columbia was used as a staging camp for the liberalisation and recolonisation of the Dutch East Indies. I'm just trying to see. So this page here and the next few slides show examples of records from series MP12/1, Department of Treasury correspondence files from 1939 to 49, with our series note stating the filing is very bad. This letter was sent to the Quartermaster General on the 5th of April 1944 regarding the NEI taking over the US Camp Columbia. So some time ago, Mr. Van Hoogstraten came to me and said that they had been in touch with General Alexander in connection with the taking over of a portion of Camp Columbia. And to paraphrase, I said that it had nothing to do with me, really. And in answer to a further query, I said I could offer them nothing better. So the main points that he wanted to touch on in regards to this letter was the financial question of the use of the Dutch government of a camp built by Australia for the American forces, whether we should help them to secure all the furniture which they require and under what conditions, and the arrangement of payment for services such as lighting, water, or sanitary. And as he states, these are mainly considerations which are beyond my orbit, and I would require you to let me know what you want me to do in any of these matters. So this is a letter written April 6, 1944 from the Department of Defence Treasury Liaison Officer, Mr. Dunk, to Mr. Sheehan in Treasury Headquarters, Canberra, regarding whether the Commonwealth should charge the Dutch rental for the use of Camp Columbia. The US General Purchasing Agent has reported that the US forces no longer require to occupy Camp Columbia, Brisbane. This was a camp constructed for the US under the reciprocal Lend-Lease. I am also advised that the Dutch government requires to occupy the camp as an administrative headquarters. The US accepts that, in line with our policy on establishments which they vacate, reciprocal Lend-Lease entry will remain pending any financial settlement. They are not concerned in regards to arrangements which we may make with the Dutch, except that if rental is charged, they consider that the credit should be to the RLL. Please advise urgently. So this is a memorandum from the Allied Works Council in October 1944 to the Treasury Office within the Department of Defence regarding work being carried out for the Netherlands East Indies Army, alterations and extensions to existing buildings at Camp Columbia. So the Military Secretary, Royal Netherlands East Indies Army, stated, "It is desirable to advise that this work became necessary when the US Army handed over Camp Columbia through the Australian Army to this headquarters. It then became necessary to effect alterations and additions to provide for Army and living accommodation for the Netherlands Indies government officials, Army's headquarters staff, for civilian employees, male and female, service personnel, all ranks, male and female, Army, Navy and Air Force and native troops. It will be noted that it was impossible to attain suitable office and living accommodation in the city of Brisbane as has been possible with the Australian and US forces. And therefore, with these alterations and the use of Camp Columbia by this headquarters for the above purposes has been the most practical and economical solution to our problem." The Dutch refurbishment of Camp Columbia began in June 1944. All building work needed approval of the Australian Department of War Organisation and Industry Works Priorities Subcommittee, but the work was paid for and carried out by the Dutch. The NEI Labour Battalion, bought from the camp at Casino, New South Wales, was tasked with improving the camp. This battalion comprised of interned non-European NEI nationals, as well as Indonesians opposing Dutch rule in the NEI, and overseen by Dutch officers, constructed new office buildings, club facilities and a laundry, while showers and toilets were added to the accommodation huts. The Australian government took the unusual step of not charging the Dutch for the lease of the site under a reciprocal Lend-Lease agreement. The NEI forces were maintained at various camps and were charged only for actual supplies made to them and eventually the cost of services such as electricity, water, telephones. So this file here relates to the seeking of approvals and making sure that the Dutch government was following proper processes. It also further questions about charging rent to the Dutch. The key element here is that it is pointed out that Camp Columbia was originally erected for use by the US Army. Full details of the work required by the Netherlands authorities were not available, but owing to the urgency of the matter, arrangements were made for the work to be carried out by day labour on a preliminary requisition for £1,000, and a cheque for this amount was received from the Royal Netherlands Indies Army. So this letter regarding the Dutch occupation of Camp Columbia was sent to the Treasury Department within the Department of Defence on November 22, 1944. My recollections of the conditions under which this camp was made available to the Dutch are, at a meeting between Mr. Vandyk and Baron someone or other, Mr. Chiefley and Mr. McFarlane, it was agreed that the Dutch could have the use of Camp Columbia without any charge. Yes, someone or other. Any alterations and additions, etc., were to be met by the Dutch authorities, and this would rule out any question of charging them rental of use for this camp. So this is the Department of Labour and National Service Minute from the 7th of August 1944 regarding the mess room facilities for NEI Headquarters Camp Columbia following an inspection. So there are 4 mess rooms of the standard USA type on the area, and it is intended to alter only 2 for the time being, the alterations to be in respect of kitchens. Sketch plans will be based on kitchen output of 250 hot meals, 1 kitchen to cater for officers and the other to cater for female clerical staff. All personnel live on the area, so that consideration is to be given to a service of 3 meals per day. The kitchen is to be staffed with native labour. Wood fuel will be utilised for ovens, electricities and other items of the plant. Provision to be made of serving both tea and coffee. So these snippets are from Series BP1/1 by the Allied Works Council Queensland and contains decisions relating to wartime work, including construction, maintenance of camps, roads, aerodromes, airstrips, railways, docks and wharfs for the RWAF, Army, etc. So the Queensland AWC minutes, or Allied War Council minutes, in Series BP1/1 are all digitised. So 26 volumes, some containing over 1,000 pages. But it really captures a great insight into the work, the building, the construction that was done by the Department of Defence in Queensland. So it is worth 1,000 pages trawl. So these snippets on the screen are from an AWC meeting on the 25th of August 1944 regarding Camp Columbia alterations and extensions work for the Netherlands Indies Army. And I think I'll capture the key element here, which another aspect of the matter to be considered is whether the approved standards for the USA and service departments have been departed from in this case, and to what extent such departures have been made. He asked for urgent advice and that pending further instructions, this office refrain from undertaking additional works for the Netherlands East Indies authorities unless prior approval is received from head office. So essentially just double checking, confirming why these alterations and extensions were needed, if it was perfectly suitable and established by the United States. So the lengthy expenditure list on the right is from a file relating to the Department of Treasury correspondence relating to alterations and additions to Camp Columbia. So my personal favourite is the entry with the hash, picture show for £350. Other expenditures include £64 for the shelving of the tailor shop, signs for £51, and an expensive detention compound for £5,128. And the works requisition page on the left just acknowledges the cheque received for £24,232 worth of alterations and additions. So alterations and additions, as I said, began in June with these plans here. And then this sheet here detailing additions to Block 5 in June 1944. So once again, while the Australian War Cabinet approved in principle the basing of 30,000 NEI troops in Australia, almost a year later, on the 28th of June 1945, the Australian War Cabinet rejected the previous approval to accept the troops, leading to this meeting on June 2, 1945, between Australian Acting Prime Minister Ford and representatives of the Netherlands government, Baron van Aersen, who I believe was the Baron someone or other, General Van Ooyen and Dr. Van Mook. So from Mr. Ford, I realised that it is only right that there should be something definite on the matter, and I will have the question looked into immediately, and if necessary, have consideration given to it at the next War Cabinet meeting. I will see that you are communicated with as soon as possible after that. With Baron van Aersen's response, if there are any difficulties, it would be very hard to make other arrangements. We would expect nothing less than an approval because things have been approved in principle and we have never heard anything new or that any changes have been made in these decisions. With Van Mook to finish. In the meantime, we are in a very difficult position. If we have to change our plans, it will set us back 3 or 4 months. These troops will commence to arrive in September. Some of the troops on the water will arrive earlier. We agreed to take over the servicing of the camps and men, and as soon as we had the men here, it will put us all in a very bad position at the last moment if it's not all right. So I'll skip this one here, but essentially it's the Department of External Affairs sending a letter and confirming that we will not be able to go ahead with accepting the troops. And then on the 11th of September 1945, Prime Minister Chifley had sent a letter to Baron von Essen explaining why Australia could not accept the troops, and this was a very firm response from the Prime Minister, and it's multiple pages, and I would have included it if I could. So essentially with Baron von Essen's response was, "Dear Prime Minister, I acknowledge with thanks the receipt of your letter on September 11th, 1945 regarding the proposal of training of Dutch troops in Australia. I agree with you that the position has completely changed since I originally approached you, and I therefore want to confine myself to thanking you for the trouble you took to explain certain aspects of the matter to me." So once again, I'll blow through here, but essentially it led to an incident as reported in the Argus on the 5th of November about Dutch troops not being able to land, 1,600 troops not being able to land in Sydney, where the original plan was that they would then go into Camp Columbia. So there was also a mutiny of the NEI forces at Wakehull as well, as well as both in Bundaberg, so there were 231 all up. The camp commandant at Wakehull is in some difficulty as he has no Dutch troops within which to preserve order and to enforce compliance with directions given to these mutineers, who, however, have given no trouble to the small forces which have been placed at Lytton for their administration. Alrighty, and I have a minute left, so I'll completely off script from here. So once again, it's the discussion of the Dutch planning to leave Australia, as reported here in the Daily Telegraph in April 1946. And then we have documents here relating to Dutch, Eurasian and Indonesian evacuees who fled the Japanese occupation. So evacuees who arrived without passports were required to fill out an NEI registration form. They were subsequently given a passport by the Netherlands Indies Welfare Commission for evacuees. So this is what was accepted in lieu of a passport. So these pages on screen are from the Department of Immigration on Dutch evacuees and contains a list here of the evacuees arriving at Camp Columbia, Wakehull. So this is an example of the passbook. And we have many applications for alien registrations of the Dutch who arrived in Brisbane and stayed at Camp Columbia in Wakehull, over 1,200. So this will include things like the place of birth, occupation, personal description, and when they departed Australia as well and returned, which is just down here. Alrighty, so this is the final letter from Canberra in September 1947, which affirms the withdrawal of Dutch forces by October 1947. So I'll skip to the end. The department has the honour to request the legation to advise it of the strength of the Netherlands forces still in Australia and whether the withdrawal of these forces could be completed by October 10th. So I'll quickly pass through, but this is the National Archives website. If you click the big blue button, which is record search, that takes you to our online database, which is what it looks like here. So there's a keywords function where you can put in any of the key terms that you might be looking to search for. So for this talk today, I use the terms Wakehull, Camp Columbia, NEI, Dutch, Netherlands, Netherlands East Indies. It's being really flexible in your thinking and what keywords you put in, because the federal government is not consistent in our titling. So some of the items, including all the files you've seen from me today, so all of the snippets, all of that's all digitized and available on our website. So when you're looking for files and you want to see if it's digitized, this little notebook on the side there, if you click on that, that brings up the full file for you, especially if you're interested in those BP 1/1 1,000 page ones. Alrighty, and just to quickly plug out myself a bit further, the National Archives has a free Ask Us a Question service where if you've got any questions or you need any research assistance with what we have in our collection, you can send through a question to us, send through an email to us. We go off and do the research in our collection, get back to you with what we find, what we don't find, or which organisation might be a bit better suited. So as I said, that's a free service. Just on our website as well, help with your research and then ask us about the collection. We have standard business days standard service of 30 business days. And as I said, I'm located in Queensland. I work out at Cannon Hill. We have an office in each state and territory, so we're not just Canberra based. We're open to the public Wednesday to Friday, 9 until 4:30, so please feel free to come in anytime. And you can also just ring us during business hours as well. And yeah, we do our own events and exhibitions as well, with our next seminar in October on photographs within the collection. Thank you very much. I'm so sorry. Dutch voices from the Australian War Memorial Archives.
archives. So we're going to a different archive now. All yours.
Okay. It's interesting that's an official record, and that's something I'll talk about in a little bit as well. But firstly, I'll just start off by saying that the Australian War Memorial is an institution that was conceived on the battlefields of the First World War, and that vision really was to talk about the horrors of war and tell that story back home for people that couldn't get overseas to see or learn for themselves. And so by about 1916, 17, the concept of the War Memorial was already starting to get underway, and there was lots of lobbying back to Australia to build a museum in Australia. And the concept of the memorial that still stands today is that it would be about 1/3 commemorative, a shrine to the fallen, 1/3 galleries to tell their stories, and 1/3 a grand archive and library. And I'm from the Grand Archive and Library. And the strange thing about the memorial is we do hold official records, but luckily it's on the same database as the National Archives' collection. It's on Record Search. So if you're searching for official records, you just go to archives, and the War Memorials collection is, for the Second World War, is all catalogued, and so you'll find our collections. The difference, and you will see it if you think about it, that we were talking about the home front here. We were talking about government at high level, and we were talking about stuff on the ground at Camp Columbia. This is the home front. It has a war theme, but it's definitely a home front story. The War Memorials collections are more around operational records. Our official records collection are more around operational records, and this is around what Australian forces were doing, and less at that high level, but more about what's happening on the ground. What did that unit do? What did that battalion do? And so for the Dutch-Australian interactions, when I was having a look at what the memorial held, there was a lot of early pre-fall of Singapore exchange of information. The memorial holds some of the intelligence and information exchanged, some ABDICOM reports and that kind of thing. And it's around the operations on the ground. That's the way to think about it, I guess. And I found this interesting fall of Singapore document that was ABDICOM, America, Britain,
Australia, British, Dutch,
America.
Australia,
Britain, Dutch, America. I had a moment of like Dutch is, yeah, thank you. And so those kind of reports appear in the collection. And I better pick this up and move on before I start saying other weird things. Ooh, how does that go? That way?
The weight is a bit slow.
You can also use the
Hey, Gil?
Thank God. All right. Although the War Memorial is a museum and an archive and a library, and so we do hold stuff in and around things. We're big collectors over these years. So we opened the memorial in 1941 during the Second World War, and we set our pattern for collecting really based on the First World War. And that might have some effects on how we tell this home front story a little later. But these are Dutch ships. That's a Dutch ship in 1940 under the Harbour Bridge. And there's a lot of records in Memorials collection around Dutch shipping. And this one stands out. This is the Oranje, and this stands out quite prominently in the Memorials collections. And that is, now what's his name? That is somebody that you mentioned. He's Major General here.
Yes, de Port.
Yeah, de Port. And Captain Zimmerman. They're doing the handover of the Oranje in 1941, and that ship is was used extensively for troop and hospital ship movements, and the political decision around that handover is by the by the Dutch government in exile in Britain before they came to Australia.
Came up with them together.
Yeah, and yeah, luxury, very fast cruise liner that was a flagship, and throughout the war, Dutch people and Australian people had experienced the Oranje. The memorial holds official records related to the Oranje. We hold operational records around the hospital ships that operated, and also the general movement of the transport. There's probably stuff in archives as well. This is a photo from our collection, and they're Dutch nurses and Australian on the hospital. Australians recuperating or getting help on the hospital ship. The ship sailed under an Australian flag. It was gifted to Australia for the course of the war, and we handed it back at the end of the war. And it was crewed by the Dutch throughout. So interesting story for connectivity. I'm doing a bit of a Dutch and Australian gaze as I'm talking around through this. So this is the Australian gaze. So Australians knew many Dutch people in the prisoners of war camps throughout the Second World War internment period. Now, this is not an official record. So what the memorial also has extensively collected since about the 1920s are letters and diaries of Australians that served. So this was something that was very organised back in the 20s by Charles Bean to write the official history as the official historian of the First World War, and that trend continued into the Second World War. So we collect, if you look at other institutions, like a parable example for the First World War was the State Library of New South Wales, who was paying for letters and diaries, but choosing really high quality written papers. The Australian War Memorial, because of its kind of mandate and its mission, collected everybody's papers, so it was like a broad sweep of material, and it was after any kinds of detail that it can on the experience of war. This is papers. This picture comes from papers by one of the nurses that survived the sinking of the Viner Brook, Pat Gunther, and the Dutch, the Australian nurses worked very closely with the Dutch nuns during their period of internment and write about that relationship. Now this is the Dutch gaze, and this is complex collecting for the memorial, and really only got going, I would say, in 20 to 30 years ago. I don't think we were looking that hard for that diaspora story. And so, and I've got to remember everybody's names. This is about 28, this is a collection of Mrs. Frederica Hazels van Saal, and she was at Camp Carice, and she was gifted about 28 beautiful watercolours of camp life, and it was in thanks to her hard work in the kitchen during this time. And kitchen's a tough gig with people that are starving. You really had to control people's emotions, and you know who's getting more, and you guys are siphoning stuff off the top. There's a lot of politics around food when people are starving, and she was gifted these drawings, and this picture here is the first orphans of the camp, and this picture's here around kitchen and doing jobs around the camp. So it's a beautiful documentation of camp life at Camp Carice. Why does the War Memorial hold this collection? Well, because Mrs. Frederica Hazels van Saal was evacuated to Australia at the end of the war, and as far as I could tell she ended up in Melbourne, but I'm not 100% sure. I haven't actually been able to follow the paper trail to see if whether she ended up in Brisbane or whether she stayed in Melbourne, but then later ended up back in the Netherlands and then circled back to Australia later as an immigrant. And that's a very common journey for the material in the memorials collection that reflect private records. This beautiful collection of botanical playing cards. They're all drawn, Foods of the Forest it was called, and it was gifted to a 10-year-old boy in the camp at Camp Carice as well, and he ended up immigrating back to Australia. He ended up in Australia recuperating, back in the Netherlands, and then back in Australia as an immigrant, and the collection at some point has made its way to Australia. I really, though, when I was doing this search, I was looking for connections with Camp Columbia and the people that came to Brisbane, because I hear talking about that. And so I was diving deep at this stage and feeling a bit nervous about committing to this talk, because I wasn't finding a hell of a lot. However, I got there in the end. And how I found these collections is because who's cataloguing them in Australia had this catalogued as Coolangatta Camp, so I was able to find it. But she stayed at, this is Mrs. Koningsberg Dosey, and it's a very interesting story. She was at Camp Columbia and at Coolangatta, and she lives in Holland, or in Holland. So she was when she was interned in the NEI, she was a camp youth worker, and she's only 24 at this stage when she's back in Australia, and she was there to sort of help guide the youth when they were interned. But the interesting thing is she was also appointed to this role when she was at Camp Columbia. She was the camp youth worker at Camp Columbia. So apart from the fact that she was starved and had trauma for 3.5 years and had that role of being the camp youth worker there, she was also employed to do that work back in Australia and continued her work in Australia. And I found that interesting in that, you know, I know from the Australian POW's experience how long it took to recuperate from the prisoner of war years. But the reason why we have this in the collection is that a journalist from the Coolangatta local newspaper must have got in contact with her in some way, and he wrote to her, and she's in Holland, wrote to her and asked her about her work at Camp Columbia. And so she wrote in 1979 about her times there. She talks about how they weren't very careful with the food when they introduced food back to the people that had been starving for 3.5 years. They ate too much rich food, and there's a lot of illness. And then this got written up in the Coolangatta, whatever the local paper's called, I can't quite remember now, but and that was to remember, I think it was the 35th anniversary of Camp Columbia. So a roundabout way, the journalist at some point must have decided that would be something nice for the War Memorials collection and donated it. So the War Memorial, when it's offered a collection like that, assesses it to see if it fits into our collection development policy. It covers war, it covers the prisoner of war experience, it fits our collection, and so we took it in. So we have local stories in our collections, of course, because everybody's from somewhere. One of the other interesting, this is another official record, and one of the interesting things is that who came in with the evacuees too. So there's some stories, and I think this is in archives, probably one of those ones you digitise where they were sending Germans back home very quickly who came in with the Dutch. But this is an interesting one. This is at archives. This is not at the War Memorials. This is the Indian Army, and there was some British Indian subjects who had worked with the Japanese during the war, and this document's talking about what kind of procedures around this type of having these people at Camp Columbia. So interesting, War's End, who ends up in the mix, I guess. And then, so yes, there's letters and diaries. I did have to follow hard through to see where people ended up and how they came. This is the Krahls, and they were separated. He's a merchant navy, and she had 2 kids, and they were separated in 2 different camps throughout their internment. And the reason why this is in the collection is because the family wrote a book using the photos and the memories of the experience. And most of the narrative is actually Hans Krall and Ida Krall. So I'm not sure who Henry is, but he might have helped publish and put the thing together. So these are common now. You can go and publish a nice hardcover book and you pull together all your family's records and photos. And if they're offered to the memorial, we have a look at it, and if it's got some relevance to the collection, we take them. So I started looking through a fair few of these, and stopped when I got to somebody who'd spent some time at Camp Columbia. And he's got some photos of recuperation in the book at Camp Columbia, and they talk about their prisoner of war experience. He talks about having to pay out of his wage to stay there. So that's so Australia's charging the Dutch, and then the Dutch are charging the people that are staying there, and he was not happy about that. That's something that stayed with him a very long time, having to pay. And I guess too, these types of books end up in a lot of different cultural institutions. They can end up at the National Library, they can end up at Brisbane State Library, so if you're looking for stories and pictures and things that you don't have, they're worth a bit of a deep dive. And I also thought towards exhibition and things like that in the future, you try and find the family down the line. I bet you they're still in Brisbane somewhere, and have other memorabilia and other stories to help tell that tale. And finally, a Canberra, Brisbane, Dutch-Australian love story. So Beryl is from Canberra, and her husband Harry was in the Air Force, and there was the Dutch NEI Air Force stationed in Canberra, and it's not very far from where the War Memorial is. Anyway, they met, married, fell in love, and she and then he gets stationed up in Brisbane. So they have they spend quite a little bit of time in Brisbane, and then the next step is he's going back to the NEI at the war's end to do some recolonisation. And Beryl travels with him with a young baby, and she talks about the horrible conditions on the ship going over. And she does mention that some of the Dutch people going back said, this is nothing. So, yeah, complex. They spend a fair few years there, but get out luckily before war's end, and before the Civil War breaks out, and they end up in the Netherlands, and then the journey back to Canberra, and she donated her letters, her memoirs and photos and that kind of thing of that journey and experience. That journey back, there was another collection I didn't manage to snap a photo of, but I thought I'd mention it here, where a woman, she lost her soldier husband pretty early in the East Indies and was interned for 3.5 years. Ended up in Australia recuperating, and then back to the NEI, which was probably her home. She's pretty young, but stayed there too long and got, for her own protection, interned. And the last little bit of her writing is just seeing the gates kind of close on her again, you know, horrific. But she must have ended up Holland and back in Australia in some way, because we have her collection. Pretty much anything in the memorials collection has come from the Dutch diaspora, except for, you know, the odd outlier. So if you search Dutch, Netherlands, you end up getting a whole bunch of other things, but generally the letters and diaries in our collection are there. And we have quite a few, we've collected a lot over the years. So this is the new research centre. This is my final plug. We're open now. We've been closed, not closed, we remained open in a very limping along way during 5 years of development, where we were, you know, gathering collection through a building site, and the collection was okay, it was just us having to put PPE. What happened is our archive ended up in the middle of the building site, and all tools were down at lunchtime. We'd go in, get our records for the next, you know, few months, and put it on hold in a very temporary reading room. But now we're open and back to normal service And the only other thing I'll add just very quickly is, because we talked a lot about exhibitions yesterday, and there was a Dutch Australian exhibition that was pretty much approved and got well underway about 15 years ago at the Memorial. It was called Allies in Adversity, and the work that was done on that is actually on our website. And the exhibition collapsed actually due to lack of enough material in the Memorial's collection to tell the story. So it's a complex thing about who does exhibitions, and it is that thing of crossover. Don't forget, we're an operational place, we're about war and veterans, and everybody thinks war immediately, but war affected the home front, and the Memorial was maybe a bit slower in sort of collecting that Second World War home front stuff than we have. We've got a lot more than we had 15 years ago, but it's still probably less than you'd have in other museums in Brisbane and other places. Anyway, just an interesting food for thought. And I'll finish on that note. Thank you.